And one of the first ones I had was this little beauty called the Atari ST. And the Atari ST took things to another level, because instead of having cassettes to put into things, I was suddenly got these really, really strange square things, which are obviously floppy disks. And all of a sudden, more information could be put on these. You didn't, because obviously a cassette could only contain a small amount of information. But suddenly you had these floppy disks, and the games on them had advanced. Suddenly there was more graphics, there was more you could do on them. Obviously, this is just a little image of what the disc looked like.
If I'm going to just go back in time a little bit to the 1980s, I remember from being at school, I've mentioned about the 20-minute loading times on home computing.
Yeah.
But I remember when we were at school, because most of the schools back then, there was this big initiative by the BBC to get every school in the country to have a computer and learn computer skills. So a lot of the computing in the 1980s in schools was all based around disk systems. Now, you're talking about the Atari ST, which had a 3.5 inch floppy disk. Even though it was solid plastic, it was a floppy disk inside when you took it apart, and that would store, I think, 720 meg. But the older floppy disks were literally as big as a CD.
They were,
and they were like a cardboard basically, rather than plastic. And the main reason that a lot of people used the disks was for quicker loading times.
Mm-hmm.
And the main reason the schools used them, because if you had a 40-minute computer lesson that's it there. If you had a 40-minute computer lesson, the last thing you wanted to do was spend 20 minutes loading in a program to demonstrate what would happen. So it was literally, loading times went from 20 minutes to, say, 20 seconds.
Yes.
And it's hard to think now that when people sit there with like an Xbox game or a PlayStation game or a modern PC game, if they have to sit for 10 seconds for it to load, they go, oh, this is taking ages.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
But that was the main progression from disc to tape, because tape, you could pretty much store whatever the tape could hold, really. A 90-minute tape, you could store 50 games on it. But there were some tapes that were just 20 minutes, which most games came on.
Yeah.
But the floppy disk opened up a new market. You could have multi-loaded games where you didn't have to keep swapping and changing the direction of the place on the tape. It would be there straight away. So it'd get to the end of the level, and instead of loading in from the tape and waiting another 20 minutes and then having to go back when you died and go back to the beginning, you could literally just go, we're into that level, we're into that level, we're into that level. And that was the key thing. That was the big difference.
The beauty of the floppy disks, especially the ones for the home computers, was that the big 5.25 ones, they were very, very fragile. The data on them was literally, it could be lost so simply, just a simple spillage on them or something like that. Whereas when the home computers came and they had the hard floppy disks, suddenly they were a bit more durable. They could take a little bit more stick, and obviously they had a protection on them.
I do remember hearing stories of people putting
yes, so do I.
Putting discs into like the TV cabinet, and the radiation from the TV would blank the disc.
It could wipe the data like that. When these floppy disks came out, as in what we call floppy disks, which is very ironic because they weren't floppy, they were solid. All of a sudden, you had a metal part on them that you could pull to one side, and you could see you could see the disc with the data on, or you could cover it up, and that give it that added protection so that it couldn't wipe as easily.
Yeah, I think that the big reason why we stuck with cassettes for so long in the 1980s was the cost, because computer disk drives for the things like even some of the older computers we talked about, like the Commodores and the Spectrums and the Commodore 64, they had floppy disk based systems, and they all used these 5.5-inch floppy disks. I think Sinclair made their own version of their drive. I know Amstrad certainly did. They made a sort of 3.75-inch disc. It was their own bespoke disc.
Mm-hmm.
But the technology was very expensive. You were talking at least another £100.
Exactly, and people hadn't got it.
And people just hadn't got it. You spend £100 on a computer. The last thing you want to spend is another £300 just on something that you can play this on and load games in a second. Yes, there were people that needed it, schools, as we said, offices, maybe, but in the home, it was just a case of, oh, well, my game's loading, I'll go and make a cup of tea, I'll put a picture in the and I'll ring me nan or whatever. And that was the way. And the games themselves, there was no difference in the games. It was just you had to wait an extra 10, 20 minutes as opposed to a few seconds.
And the other thing I think, and all that changed was suddenly the games became more advanced. Suddenly you were using words to control things. You could type in and get them to do what you asked them to do. A good example behind me now. I know there was some on the earlier computers, they were very, very basic, but suddenly you could get a character to use lookup, pick something up and do things with. And of course, that then made people think, hang on, these aren't all just about going around shooting everything that moves and trying to get somewhere. You can actually get some enjoyment from them. You can feel like it's an entertainment, a bit like watching a movie, really.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing and the difference, because if it is that you look at, say, the modern generation of games, there are still these games where you literally walk in a room, shoot everything, kill everything, move into the next room, pick up what's on the ground, shoot everything, kill everything, go on to the next. There's a lot of those games still, but I've always been, even from the 1980s, always been one of the people that's more into the simulation side of gaming, where you're having to think a bit, which I think is why, going back to Elite, why I think that's probably the main one that kickstarted that whole simulation revolution, really. And where you had to think and you actually go out and trade, you had to make money, you had to spend various things. And like in real life, you could do you could get rich quick by doing the criminal activities, let's say, and that was something that was never in the games. But making sort of home simulations more like the real world is more where I was looking towards my game, rather than just running around in a dark room, shooting everything, and then moving on.
I think, to be honest with you, this is where it split. This is where it split people into two types of gaming: the ones who were fast on the buttons and needed to be, and the ones who used to use some intelligence and think, "Hang on, I can actually take my time on this. I can do this at my own pace. I don't have to be forced into doing something. If I want to leave that screen how it is now, like say in the background now, you could leave it, go away, blah blah blah." If you were playing a shooter game and you were being shot at, you had to literally control the shooter and get him to shoot as fast as you can. So you had to have a lot of dexterity on the controls, where all of a sudden you got these games where they were just leisurely. You could take your time with them and do what you wanted.
There were some games like, best way I describe them is like a Sherlock Holmes mystery.
Yeah.
And you had to find a clue.
Like Monkey Island.
Unlock another thing. Yeah, things Monkey like that. And there was various games. And you were following that sort of Sherlock Holmes pattern where you were investigating, you were finding out what was there. Yeah. And the more stuff you learned, the easier the game was.
Yeah.
It was hard to get the stuff, but it was easier to get to the final outcome.
Yes.
And the big thing at the end of the game was that a lot of the games were very linear anyway. There was only so much gaming space you could fit onto a disc or onto a cassette tape. And if you're running around in a room shooting things, even now, some games, even like the fighting games, you can finish them in an hour. Whereas some of the games where you had to think about things and you had to search, and you had to go and search every box or search every room, check under every floorboard sort of thing, it extended that game a lot longer.
It did,
and it made a game that ordinarily would have lasted a day last probably a week.
I suppose,
which doesn't seem a lot really, but you could take your time, as you say. So
it's like comparing it to modern gaming. If you think about it, you can go out and buy a modern Call of Duty game and finish it in 8 hours because they've put more into the multiplayer online side of it. Whereas if you've got a game like The Sims or SimCity or City Skylines, anything like that, these can take months and months and months and months because you were constantly evolving something. And I suppose it was like that, really.
I remember playing the original theme park on the Sega console.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was one of those games where you could make a park in, say, London, and once you built that park, rather than destroying it, you could go to another city and start again.
Yes,
but the thing was, you could make 2 different parks, and I remember playing that game for hours and hours.
I know you did.
And every park was different. And that was, you could play the same method. You could do your research to unlock the rides and things like that. But you could think, well, hang on a minute. If I put that roller coaster there this time, and if I put that near the entrance, is it going to make me any more money? And that was the thing. And that was part of the thing. It was like, well, that makes more money there. But if you put it up the corner at the back of the park, nobody will visit it.
Think about it. Them sort of games, you learned a lot about economics as well, didn't you? You learned what money was, the value of money, basically. You know, you wouldn't go out and pay like £1 million for a roller coaster if all you got is 2 people coming into your park. You learned what to do when, and I think again that increased people's brain activity and made them think, hang on, there's more to computers than what you know, I've seen on the arcades where all you're doing is just shooting things up. Suddenly I'm using my brain and I'm getting something from it, you know.
Yeah, well, it was like with Theme Park because it was very much one of those games where you had to maximise what you were earning.
Yeah.
And there was little tricks, and you think about it now, you think, yeah, that makes sense. But you had to learn that. Now, if you were an amusement arcade owner or an amusement park owner, say you ran a big resort in Blackpool, like where you are, and there are various tricks that you see used. And when you play a game like Theme Park, you actually see for yourself what's actually going on.
Yeah.
Like where there's big queues. Say that there's a big queue for, they will have entertainers. They'll have stalls selling food.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, and then it makes you realise why they've put them there.
Yeah, yeah.
As you're walking around the park, you don't think anything. But when you're playing a game like that, as you're walking to the roller coaster, we're led for the big roller coasters at the back of the park.
Yes.
And when you're going past there, you're going past all these arcade rides. You're going past all these like duck shooting games, things like this. The really simple stuff, and it's just there, just purely to hook you in and make you spend more money. And
it does. Yeah.
You smell, and as you're walking down where the big rides are, which is your main target, you're smelling the burgers and you're smelling the chips cooking, and you're getting hungry, and you think, well, there's a big queue now. So while we're waiting for the queue to go down, and we'll go get something to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And all this you can learn in a computer game. And I'm pretty sure somewhere out there, even today, there's probably some executive who works for probably one of the big entertainment groups somewhere in the world, who's actually sitting people down and as a training exercise, say, right, there's the game Theme Park.
Yes.
Play that for an hour and tell me what you've learned.
Well, I
dare bet it will actually come there.
And of course, the thing is about them, when you started with Theme Park, all of a sudden they realised that these were really, really, really popular games. You know, people were buying these in their millions, and they're thinking, hang on a minute, there's an avenue here. And obviously, since then, we've gone down this completely thing where now you can have Sim Casino, Sim Ant, you can have Sim Holiday, Sim Island. You can literally have simulations for everything. Trains, aeroplane businesses. You know, it's just amazing when you think it's all started with
one of the modern games I play now is Farming Simulator. It's probably not the most exciting game in the world.
No.
But it does make you think, well, if I put my crops there, I can put the animals in that field. Then and it's really weird because it gives you this sense of
achievement, I would say, more than anything. Yeah. The thing is, though, if you think about it,
if you maximise your revenue in the game, then it gives you this confidence to think, well, I can do it in the game.
Try and do it outside. If you think about it, though, if it hadn't have been for them doing Sim Park and things like that, the modern sim game wouldn't have evolved to how it's evolved now. Because you look at, I mean, obviously you put Theme Park up now from the very, very early one, and it's dead basic. You can see through all the attractions, etc., etc. You do the modern kind of roller coaster tycoon, and suddenly everything's realistic. It looks real. But I think them games started what's been going on for the last 30 years of simulations.
Well, let's just take another example. There was a game that was out in the 80s, going back to the 8-bit computer era and the 16-bit computer era. And I remember playing this first of all on the Amiga. It was a game called Lemmings.
Yes.
Where you literally had a load of lemmings, and you had they were literally on platforms.
Got them across to wherever. Yeah.
And you had to stop them from basically committing suicide because that was because their instinct was to jump off the cliff and die.
Yeah.
And you had to get them to safety, but you had to put things like blockers in the world. In sort of like their world to stop them moving forward. You had to put tunnels for them to go down to avoid the stuff that would eat them and all this sort of things. But that was very much a 2D screen game, but literally like a platform game.
Yeah.
But the later evolution that I played of it was a 3D version, and the really weird thing was you could actually look through the eyes of the lemming.
The lemming, I've seen it.
As one of sort of like the camera views, so you could view the map from all sorts of variations. And if you were thinking, well, why is he down? You can suddenly switch to the lemming view, and you were the lemming walking down the platform, and they thought,
falling off.
There's something there I forgot to do.
If you ever wanted to know what it was like to be a lemming, tune in. So when you think about the gaming from the Atari ST, I'm gathering you didn't have an Atari ST, but did you ever have a Commodore Amiga?
I did. I had two Amiga 500s. I had one, and then I bought another one. And the reason I bought the other one was because it was a case of, at the time, it was it was hard to explain really, but back at the time, everything was all done on that sort of like computer generation from 8-bit to 16-bit.
Yeah.
And when I had my first Amiga, the Amiga market was pretty much taken over from the 8-bit era.
Mm-hmm.
The games and things were getting more advanced and everything, but there wasn't many games. And a lot of the gaming experience was still, if you wanted the cheaper games, they were still on the 8-bit machines. If you wanted the more expensive games, they were on the 16-bit machines, like the Atari ST, the Amiga.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I got rid of my first one. But then a few years later, I was given the opportunity to buy another one, and I thought, hang on a minute, let's give this another go. And
well, my first experience with Atari STs and Commodore Amigas wasn't that I bought one. I was at school and I got called in and asked what I wanted to do for work experience, because that's what we used to do back then. Anyway, I said I wanted work in computers because I was mad on them. And they sent me to a place called Town Computers that used to be in Hanley and Stoke-on-Trent, which is no more. And I walked in expecting to be operating computers, computer programming, but I wasn't. I was actually selling computer games and selling computers. So when I was sitting there saying, you know, there's nobody in, what am I going to do? They used to just say, well, get a game and play on one of the computers if you want. And that got me into Atari ST and Commodore Amigas. And I couldn't really separate them as to which was the best one because the graphics were so similar. You know, it was even to this day, I still think there's so much the same about them. They're almost the same layout. If you look at the last computer I showed you in this one, they're almost the same layout. But I think Commodore must have thought, you know, Atari, you're onto something here. We need to expand a little bit. And when the Amiga came out, the game suddenly took on a whole new graphic and a whole new understanding. And all of a sudden, you were able to have games that went on 3, 4, and 5 discs, 6 discs. And you could literally play them.
On a hardware scale, I would have thought that the Commodore Amiga ST generation, if you can call it a generation, was a stopgap between. I've progressed from the Commodores, the Spectrums, the Dragon 32s, and all the other 8-bit machines around in the 90s. You've progressed from them, but you're not quite ready for a PC.
Yeah.
And I think if anything, the Atari ST and the Amiga was slap bang in the middle between the home computer and the business computer sort of side of the IBM PC world. And when you're looking at the hardware specs on the Amiga and the ST, they were very similar. There were parts where the Amiga was better on the hardware side. There were parts where the Atari ST was better on the hardware side.
Yeah.
I think disk access times were a little bit different. I think the Atari ST could read the disk faster, but the Atari couldn't handle the processing speed of the games.
Correct. Yeah,
things like that. There were discrepancies. But it's funny you should say about going into the computer and video game sales industry market, I suppose. And I do remember that it was one of the weird things, not so much that I was doing, but I do remember back in the 1990s, I was fixing video games and fixing hardware, where you went more into the software side, I went more into the hardware and the technology side. And I do remember that there were some people there that were doing this sort of thing, and they were saying, well, go and play the game. If you want to sell the game, you've got to understand it.
Yeah.
And the reason, because when people come into the shop, somebody could come in the shop and say, right, what's the best game to buy now? What would you recommend? You can turn around and say, well, I've been playing this.
Yes.
And you can do this on it, you can do this on it, rather than just reading the back of the card on the back of the box and going, yeah, in this game, it's a 2-player shooting game. It's a multiplayer level sort of scenario. You can actually describe the game. You can describe the graphics. You can describe the sound.
Well, just as a little aside before you carry on with that, I was just going to say to you, you've just mentioned a Dragon 32, and it takes me back to another computer memory of mine years and years ago. Now, many years ago, this is a nostalgia trip for you, Ian. Years and years ago, the Weetabix characters used to have names.
Yes.
Like Dunk, etc., etc. Now, we had a box of Weetabix, and on the back there was a competition. And the first prize was a Dragon 32 computer. And the second prize was a poster with all the figures on of the Weetabix glowing in the dark. Now, I wanted that, you see. I wasn't bothered about the computer at the time. And I did actually get the poster because I came runner-up, and I actually won the poster. And for years, I used to think, I wonder what a Dragon 32, because at that point, I'd never heard of a Dragon 32. And it was only years later I looked into it that I found out that it was kind of like a computer that never really hit the massive market that the Spectrums and your Commodores did.
And the reason it was called the Dragon 32 was because it was developed and manufactured in Wales.
Wales, yeah.
Which I think when we're talking about computers in the modern era, you look at the computer technology, you've got the IBM PC, Compaq, HP, Lenovo, and all these big name companies, Dell, and they're all based in America.
Yeah. Well, folks, it's time to give you another break from mine and Ian's faces, and coming up are a few images and a little bit of the music from the Amiga and ST era of games. I hope you enjoy them, and if you had an Amiga or ST, maybe these might jar your memory a little bit. Enjoy, and we'll be back to talk a bit more after this.
And you look at some of the gaming systems, Sega, Nintendo, and all the other ones based from the Japanese era. So
yeah, that's true.
Your PC market came from America.
Mm-hmm.
Your home console market, certainly back in the early days, came from Japan. But what people probably don't realise is back in the 1980s, and certainly in the 1970s, a lot of the forefront in the home computing market, I'm not talking about the games
the
console,
UK, wasn't it? Yeah.
Because Atari's American. But you look at Commodore, they had a base in Nottingham. Dragon 32 was based in Wales. The Spectrum and I think Acorn.
Acorn, Acorn Electron,
which made the BBC Micro. They were based in Cambridge. And Chris Curry, who actually founded the Acorn computer brand, was actually a former employee of Clive Sinclair.
Yeah.
And the reason they parted company is that Chris Curry said to Clive Sinclair, well, I want to go down this route. And Clive Sinclair was like, no, we're not going down that route.
Yeah.
We're going down this route. And Chris Curry went, well, that's it, I'm off. And he made his own computer company.
He did, yeah.
And because of that, there was a lot of British companies. And I really think it's a great shame.
It is. Massive shame.
When we got to the late 1980s, the British home computer market was pretty much dead in the water.
Yeah, it was dead in the water.
A lot of these companies had failed. The payrolls on some of these companies were massive, absolutely massive, and things like this. But the American market came along. They were swallowed up by the Compacts, the HPs, the Microsofts, and it would have been a real shame just to see what could have.
Yeah, to see it would have been interesting if things had changed out differently.
We know what's happened, but what could have not happened if that had been done differently.
So, of course, one of the big selling points about the Amiga was, yes, the games weren't as cheap because all of a sudden, with them being on discs like the Atari ST, you couldn't pick them up for $2.99 or nothing like that. But they now started coming with colour manuals and extras like maps and, booklets and things like this. And suddenly people were actually collecting the games rather than just playing the games.
I think this is the thing. I'm just going to take you back now again to the Pong era and the early 80s era. Yeah. There were some consoles and computers in that time that were made that just literally were a black and white screen. So you play the game like Pong was on a black and white screen. And if you wanted a colour screen, yes, late colour versions came along when the Atari 2600 came along. But there were parts in the box, and I don't know if you remember these, but there were like clear like Perspex gels that you had to physically tape to the screen. That would give you a background.
That would give you a background,
And I always thought that when they started doing these add-ons, we've talked about Elite when it came with
keyboard layout
with all the ships on and all the keyboard layout, the manual, the novel, and everything, and the stuff in it. Always goes back. I always get that image in my head of like when games used to come out, and the cartridge came with a piece of plastic that used to go over the TV screen to convert it to a colour screen or give you an extra layout. When you're talking about the Amiga, that they took that little bit further.
Yeah.
Because, I can't remember what the game was, but I do remember there was one game for the Amiga. I think it was like a manager sim, like a football manager type game or something like that, but it actually came with a badge, and that was unheard of. And there was all the sort of like adaptations where there was they were coming out where the hardware will be changed as well. So they might come with you see it a lot sort of in a lot of the console era, especially where the games will come say with a microphone that you could boss characters around. And there was that sort of thing. So you're actually getting peripherals and add-ons with the games to actually play the game rather than just a map of the characters or a layout. So you were actually getting physical things. And it's still being done in some modern games where I think in one of the most memorable games that I've got on the from the Xbox days is a game called Fable. And you'd actually get a pack of cards in there and you could shuffle these cards out to determine, instead of thinking, well, do we go that way, you could shuffle these cards out, or you'd have a coin. Now, do we do this the good way or the bad way? So you flip this commemorative coin, and if it landed on the blue side, you went down the good path, and when you got to this, and when you went on the other side, you could go down the bad path. And a lot of these add-ons came about, I think, in that Amiga era, and it wasn't so much a camera perspective. And when I say camera perspective, I mean you could look in different directions. You could take that route, or you could look that, or you could look that way. It was more done in this. The choices were there. There was more choice. You could play the game two ways, and stuff was in the box where you could take either direction.
I also think this was a time. Sorry, I also think this was a time when more and more companies suddenly thought, "Hang on a minute, if we are bringing out such a game, say like a snooker game, lads, I've got in the background now. How about if we get a star to endorse it?" And suddenly it came big money, because suddenly you were getting like Ian Botham's cricket, Jimmy White's Whirlwind snooker, and it was suddenly it was going from this home computing simple thing to a massive, massive multi-million-pound industry.
Yeah, I remember. I'm going back to the old Amstrad days, the Amstrad 464, and I had a Nigel Mansell racing game, and it was endorsed by Nigel Mansell.
Yes.
And I can always remember there was a thing in one of the computer magazines where I think it pretty much hailed from the Daley Thompson days again. Daley Thompson was probably the big first celebrity.
He was, I think he was.
Get behind the game, but then we started seeing other games like American football games that were endorsed by a player.
Madden,
like say football. John Madden, that was the one. And there was games like that. There was various sports teams getting involved. I think it was a basketball game, something like Lakers versus Jets or something like that. And that was the game, because those two teams had endorsed the game. But it was like a full series of basketball. And this is like pre-eras when sporting simulators were changing from one decade to the next. Because I think the key thing from my perspective is when we saw the generation go from the Pong era to go into the home computing era, to like the Spectrums and the Commodores, we saw a massive leap forward in technology.
Yeah.
And with that leap forward in technology, the games progressed from being basic and simple to being what we were playing in the arcade. And then we came from the home computer market into the next level of gaming, from the Amiga sort of level, where games took that home arcade sort of experience and they took it that step further.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Where we're going, as we say, into the simulations. And a lot of people thought, well, hang on a minute, people are making money out of this. Yeah. Why can't we make a bit of money out of this as well? And that was the key thing, I think.
I think what they were also doing, they were thinking, hang on a minute, we're bringing out a snooker game. There's hundreds of snooker games. How can we get ours to sell better? Yeah, we will find somebody who's a star of the day. And obviously Jimmy White, massive in the 80s, and 90s, very, very popular guy, still is now. And all of a sudden, Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker come out and people were going, you can play Jimmy White on it. You can play Jimmy White on it. Yeah. And it was like that extra buzz on the game that made people suddenly say, I'm having that snooker game over that snooker game. Do you know what I mean? And that's what I found.
The one game I remember is Barry McGuigan's boxing game.
Yeah.
At the time, back in the 1980s, Barry McGuigan, if you weren't around then, he was a massive boxer. He's probably one of the best lightweight British boxers that we've seen.
Yeah.
He was Irish, fair enough, okay. But as far as the Brits were concerned, he was British. It was that Andy Murray thing, wanted to. When he was winning, he was British. When he wasn't winning, he was Scottish.
Yes,
and it was the same with Barry McGuigan. When he was winning, he was British. When he wasn't winning, he was Irish. But there was a Barry McGuigan boxing game, and I could always remember it for being one of those games where you started off as this amateur, and you were in the gym, you were sparring, you were training, and you were in like the local sort of like local league, really, league boxing. You had to progress, and sort of like the final level, sort of like, I suppose what you could say, the final boss was Barry. You got to fight Barry McGuigan at Madison Square Gardens.
exactly same
And
with the snooker.
So there was that element as well. So if you wanted to beat the best, you had to be the best, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it was that mentality.
And I think that's, to be honest with you, playing Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker and all got me seriously into playing snooker, because I'd only played it for a little bit here and there up to the age of 15, 16. And then suddenly, about 1990, 92, something like that. Anyway, I suddenly started playing Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker, and I thought, I'm going to go down and start playing. And all of a sudden, I was enjoying the game. So I was not only playing on the computer, I was then going and playing on a proper table. Yeah. So in a way, I think that helped as well.
And again, we're back to that technology thing, aren't we? Where technology can help you.
Yes.
Because you could have practiced shots on the computer.
Yeah.
If I hit that ball at that angle, at that speed,
yes,
what's going to be the outcome? Then, if you tried that on the real table, you can see the cross dynamics of it. I'm not saying playing a game
I know,
make you a world champion, but you can see how a ball reacts when it gets hit, because they can simulate that in the game.
All to do with physics and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think taking that aside and just putting that on the back burner for a while.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the games, like the snooker games, when they came along in the 1980s, were there more as a basis to show what the computer could do.
Yes.
Because you got all these different colours. Bear in mind, in the 1980s, we had eight colours on a computer.
Yes.
Nowadays, you get palettes of 32 million or something.
Yeah.
But back in the 1980s, it was all, you had eight basic colours.
Yeah.
And the one colour you probably wouldn't have on a Spectrum or a Commodore 64 was the colour brown.
Yes.
So you couldn't have a brown ball. Then all of a sudden, the Commodore Amiga came along, where you got this 256 palettes colours schedule. So you could have
a brown.
So you could have every ball represented as a proper colour, rather than having sort of like an orange ball instead of a brown ball.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, it's all about advancement, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think, just like with the intervention of TV snooker, colour TV came along, and then all of a sudden you could watch colour TV featuring snooker, so you didn't have the commentator going, and if you're wondering which one the brown is, it's the one next to the blue. So you didn't have any of that. Yeah, you wouldn't have any of that because it was there on the screen. And there was various games that did that. They took advantage of the advancements in the colours and the spectrum. Yeah. Not the spectrum as in the ZX spectrum, but the spectrum of the colour.
Yeah, well, the thing is, when you were playing these games, it's sometimes, I know it did for me. It's allowed me to escape my life, because obviously that's what gaming is. It's escapism. And sometimes you can look at games and think that helped me get through a very, very difficult time. And I think that's why gaming will always be popular, because people do use it for escapism. It's, for some people, it is their escape from life. And when I was talking like 1989, 90, things weren't going brilliant for me. I got into doing gaming. Suddenly, I had something I could do that made me feel like I was achieving something and like I meant something. And I think that made a massive difference to me in the 90s.
And the key thing was, when you're playing video games, you weren't judged.
Correct.
When you're playing football at school, or when you're playing sports at school, let's say, you've always got somebody that's going, oh, yeah, well, I'm a better player than you. I can do this better than you. But when you're in your own environment on your computer, you are your own critic. And in fair enough, there's going to be somebody at school who'll go, yeah, but I got to level 100 on my game last night, and you've only got to level 30.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're a better gamer. Doesn't mean they're playing it better than you. But it takes that schoolyard bullying element out of it, really, I think, to me, because it's something that you're doing on your own, and your sense of achievement is in your head. It's not in the eyes of everybody else. And
the other thing I found as well is, sometimes you could start talking to somebody in school who you hadn't talked to before, and suddenly find that you both loved playing a game, Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker or whatever. And suddenly people were going, hang on a minute, I play that. When you get to such and such, how do you do? And all of a sudden, it was a good way of making friends as well. It was a really, really good tool for that.
Yeah, the weird thing was, going back to the sort of like the school, like the football team or the basketball team or whatever at school, there was none of that. Who's going to be the one picked last?
Yeah,
that didn't exist in the computer world. You went in and you played the game as you play the game.
Correct.
And I think that's the key difference. Which, like I say, was a form of escapism. Because I'll admit, when I was at school, I liked sports, but I was always the one that was picked last, and it wasn't because I was rubbish. It was because I didn't like the sports we were doing. I wasn't really into some of the sports.
Yeah.
And I didn't put the effort into it.
No.
And it was different when you're doing it on a computer. You can put as much effort in or as least effort in as you want. That's I think the difference I found. You didn't have to prove yourself to anybody, which I think is probably one of the reasons why computer gamers of then and even today have got the stigma of being geeks or being nerds or being tech junkies. And I mean, fair enough, we're sitting here now, we're both wearing glasses,
yeah,
and we're both
teched up and all that.
Yeah. But it's very much one of those things. There's no there's no outside eyes looking in.
No, there isn't. No. I think that's why I liked gaming, like you said. I mean, when I was at school, I wasn't very sporting because I didn't realise at the time I had a medical problem, but I wasn't very sporting. I was constantly falling over all the time. I had bad balance. And because of that, I was ridiculed. I was picked on. I was bullied. I had a terrible childhood. I really did at school. I didn't like life at all. I didn't want life to continue. But then suddenly I found gaming. And rather than being, like you say, rather than being the weakest in a team, suddenly I was the team. I was, controlling somebody that basically I was in control of. He didn't have any disability. He didn't have any problems. He didn't fall over all the time when he started running. And that made a massive difference to me. It really did make a huge difference to my life and how I lived it.
I'm not gonna lie on this, or I'm not gonna try and make it any worse than it probably is when I'm saying this, but there are people, I think, nowadays where they're taking the gaming too far.
Oh God, yeah.
And I'm not being nasty when I say this, but there are people that I see, even 10, 11-year-old kids, they've got no friends, but their friends are in a video game. And so I think there is that level where you can get self-isolated, but you can get self-isolated a little bit too much. So every now and again, you've got to take a step back and think, well, hang on a minute, let's turn the games off for a bit. Let's go out and do something. Let's go out and do an activity. And I think this is where the difference was between the 80s generation, where we grew up, and the modern generation. Because back in the 1980s, we were allowed out in the street. We
were talking about this the other day.
All sorts of things.
Yeah. We were talking about this the other day, and like you say, you were allowed out in the streets, but the other thing is you were encouraged to go into the streets. If we got up in a summer holiday and it wasn't raining, we were literally told, out you go.
Kicked out the door.
And then you come back in about 5 o'clock, or say midday for have something to eat, and then 5 o'clock for have something to eat. Whereas now, because obviously back then, if you wanted a game of football with your mates, you went, knocked on the door, got the football, we're going down the fields, let's have a game. Nowadays, it's, are you going on the football? Yeah, I'll just log into Xbox. And I think that's ruined childhood, to be honest. I think it's ruining childhood.
It has. I think that the social aspect now, it's probably a little bit too much. And probably because of the Facebook generation, where we don't actually need to go out and meet friends, and we don't need to go out and talk to friends on a one-to-one level. We can do it now just by going, oh, hang on a minute, right, I've got to, let's just do it this way. And it's lost something. That innocence, I think, is lost.
I think, to be honest with you, if you say, like me and you, we grew up and we got to know each other, we've been best mates for years, but we now live 100 miles apart. So it isn't easy for me to just say, oh, I'll nip down and knock on and come in for a cup of tea. So yes, in one way, technology is fantastic. We can stay in touch. We can still see each other, talk to each other and everything. But you've got people, I mean, I'll give an example. I know somebody whose son, actually, when he's in his bedroom and he wants something, he will ring his mum on the phone, or he will send a text to her to say that he wants something, rather than getting off his backside and walking down the stairs and saying, is it dinner time yet? No, he will actually phone, because he doesn't want to, and I just think that's just a real waste. That's a lazy
WhatsApp message,
generation.
Facebook message. It's lazy.
That's
when
generation.
You think, hang on a minute, and I'm not going to say that I'm the most active person in the world, because like anybody, I like sitting in front of the TV. I like watching video games. That time. There are times where you think, sometimes you just got to think, well, hang on a minute, I just need to get out there, get some fresh air. But there are, and I hate to say it, there are these people. I'm not going to single anybody out. I'm not going to point fingers or name names, but there are people out there that you think, you really need to go out and introduce yourself to a few people. Yeah. Fair enough. If things get a bit too hard, a little bit, when you start thinking, hang on a minute, they're having a go at me, you walk away, and then you go back into video game world. That's fine. Yeah. Which I think is the difference between our generation and the modern generation. And call me old, call me cynical, call me what you like, but I think that's the way it's going. Yeah, I do as well, I must admit. But even like the mobile phone technology, at one time, most houses never had a phone. No. Which means that we never had the internet. We never had any means of communication other than literally over the garden wall. or in the schoolyard, and that was our Facebook, that was our internet, if you like.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. The difference is, though, I suppose the difference is we were encouraged as children to go out. Parents find it so easy just to say, you don't want to go out. Fair enough. Go in your room, go on your Xbox or whatever, as long as you're out of my hair. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that was it. It was a cheap babysitting, wasn't it, in some ways?
Yeah.
I suppose. If it is that we're pushing forward and going into like the medical reasons and the things like this, there's a lot of video games are being blessed and blamed for things like obesity, and medical conditions. But like you said, you've got medical conditions, and it's your escape from the medical conditions in a way.
Correct.
So you've got one hand where you get your medical conditions, and on the other one, you're getting relief from the medical conditions. So I'm not going to delve too much into everything what's going on, but we just got to stop and take a look, I think, every now and again, and just change, really, I suppose.
Right.